Hello there, AP US History students. Today what I want to talk to you about is Unit 3. And we're going to be starting off today talking about politics and how was the early time period of American history organized as far as political power goes. How do you end up managing different groups of people within a very large society, especially when we're talking about the colonial time period, revolutionary time period, then afterwards with the constitutional time period. What I'm going to argue throughout this is that the Constitution really is an attack on the deference towards aristocracy. And that's really what this period is about. Now, in many ways, the people who were in charge of the Constitution were themselves an aristocracy within America, but they established these principles that eventually would be used by people afterwards to attack this notion of the deference towards some kind of higher class, that we are all in the end socially equal. That has a lot of implications for the future as well when we talk about economic equality, but at this time period, I would argue that the main thing really had to do with social equality. So in order to understand this, we're going to start off with the Colonial Assemblies before the Revolution. And this really established a tradition in American history of this notion of equality, social equality for people. And the way it did it was in the Chesapeake region. So in the Chesapeake region, our first parliament is going to get put into place, and it's called the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses was established by the second sons of noble families. Now, why were these noble families or these sons coming to America? It had to do with a system called primogeniture. Under primogeniture, back in England, the oldest sons at the time got all the inheritance. When dad died, basically the oldest son got all the land. Now, think of England. England's an island. There's very little land there, and the land's not all that great because of the placement of England within the world. So because of that, these younger sons had to go look somewhere to find decent land for themselves. Remember what we talked about with land? Land is the basis to power. So they end up going to the Chesapeake region, which today would be places like Virginia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. The belief that they had was that they would find gold. They didn't. They found brown gold or tobacco. That was found by John Rolfe. So what ends up happening is that the colonies at that time period that had this area were predominantly male. They were young and they were competitive because it's all these second sons who are coming over who are getting this inheritance. So how do you deal with all these young males who are very competitive and basically all think of themselves as entitled because they're of a noble class? Well, they formed the House of Burgesses, which was a way to solve the problem by creating everybody gets representation. But notice something here that's very important. Notice carefully that this is not giving representation to people based upon equality across the board. This really is representation for these young noblemen who basically are competing against each other, and the only way to deal with that is to have them have a place where they can debate out the issues and then vote on these issues. So in many ways, this is creating equality amongst nobles, not equality throughout the entire society. Now, colonial assemblies, though, do also get formed up in the northern colonies, especially New England. In fact, New England was built around the idea of town hall formats. How is this the case? Well, there were these churches at the time, like the Puritans, but other Protestant groups as well, that were known as Congregationalists. Congregationalists believed that their leaders, their ministers, should be elected by the people. Now, think about what that's doing. This is a religious notion. It's not political, but is establishing the principle. If we vote for our ministers to be in charge, shouldn't we be able to vote for political leaders to be in charge? You had more radical groups as well, like the Quakers. The Quakers believed in pure spiritual egalitarianism. In fact, for them, they even had men and women sitting in the same room during their spiritual worship services. That was unheard of at the time period. So up in the north, we start to see more of an idea of social egalitarianism, that people are able to vote directly for their leaders. Now, it's not perfect by any means. Within these churches, especially the Protestant churches of that time period, women were not allowed to vote. And then on top of that, too, definitely Africans who were coming over were not allowed to be a part of this or to vote. But we start to establish the principle of social equality. The southern colonies are a really good example of the huge exception of this. Because of their desire to have land and to produce tobacco, they're going to create a hierarchy of people who own land and then people who work the land, and of course eventually African slavery. So there we do see the exceptions to this rule of social equality, but the principles are moving that direction. Colonial assemblies at the time were typically set up in the following way. You had an upper house and a lower house. There was a governor in the upper house chosen by the king and the investors into the colony. But the lower house was elected by the people. Also, the people were able to hold the governor responsible. Why? Because the typical thing they would do is they would say, hey, look, we pay your salary. We will vote on whether or not how much salary you get and if you get any salary at all. So while the king was ultimately in charge, he's 3,000 miles away. The people could hold the governor responsible by dealing with the salary issue, which is a pretty powerful thing to be able to hold. So that leads up to the 1730s and 1740s, and this is where we really start to see the social equality take off in what was known as the Great Awakening politics. So in the 1730s and 1740s, there was a fight between Enlightenment ideas, or secularism, and Puritan legacies of religion. Now, the Puritans are gone. They are no longer a part of what's going on, but their beliefs are still around. And as Enlightenment ideas start to filter in, especially the idea of deism, the idea that we can know there was a God, but that God kind of left a long time ago and then put the laws of nature into effect, and we just study those laws of nature. Well, along comes two big Protestant ministers, Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, and they say, no, wait a minute, we've gone off the reservoir with that one, or the reservation with that one. The main focus for us as people who are of religion, and really Puritan children, are the notion of the intuitive experience of God, that through our emotional experience we can come to know God, and through that experience we can know that we are sinful, we are fallen, and we need His redemption. Now, that's all religious. What does that got to do with politics? Well, notice who Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield are. They are common Protestant ministers. They basically started in New York and then started moving out into the farming lands. And as they did that, they would give these huge sermons to massive amounts of common people. There's a political impact to that. The common people are now criticizing the ministers who happen to be the king's representatives. This leads us into two groups, the New Lights versus the Old Lights. The Old Lights were the people like the deists or people who were part of the Anglican Church. The New Lights are these Protestant ministers traveling around arguing in favor of Puritan ideas, not Puritans, but Puritan ideas, and criticizing these Old Lights. This really sets up a long-term political fight, the common person demanding virtuous representation. Well, this all leads up to then what sets the context for the rebellion against the king and his authority, and that is what I would call the monarch's monstrosity. And here's what happened. French-Indian War afterwards left the British with a heavy mercantile war debt. You probably remember from our Unit 2 with economics, mercantilism led into these wars to try and get raw resources. Eventually, you would have a war debt at the end. That was pretty normal to have. The British debt went from 70 million pounds, which doubled the total debt, to 140 million pounds. So because of that, the British tried to pay this off. And they paid it off with a series of taxes, the most important being the Sugar Act, which taxed foreign sugar. Now, if you think about that, there are actually two purposes here. One is to tax foreign sugar, that way you collect money for mercantilism, but also notice that any kind of tax is typically going to get people not to want to buy that item, right? Notice that these are taxes on foreign sugar items, so this was meant to, under mercantilism, to dissuade people from buying sugar from the French and the Spanish and the Caribbean. The Stamp Act, which attempted to tax all paper goods, and then the Townshend Acts, which attempted to tax imported glass, tea, and paper. Now, this very last one's important, and it will be important in the future. The Townshend Acts tried to walk a fine line between one of the complaints the colonists had, which was internal versus external taxes. The Stamp Act had been an internal tax. It was a tax about paper goods internally within the colonies. The big complaint the colonists had was, hey, in the past you always taxed us on imports and exports, now you're taxing us internally. So at the time, the Prime Minister said, fine, we'll go with that. Let's do an external tax, and that's what the Townshend Acts were, taxes on imported glass, tea, and paper. That wasn't enough for the colonists either. And so because of that, King George finally, just upset with all of this, said enough is enough. Nothing is going to satisfy these colonists. And so because of that, he began closing down the assemblies, which removes their local representation. So you can imagine when that happened, we start to move towards the American Revolution. And what I want you to see out of that is that the shutting down of those local assemblies, probably one of the biggest mistakes the king could have made, really undermines that tradition that had been forming of social egalitarianism, the ability for people to represent themselves. And when we think about who was like our big thinkers of the Revolution, it was Thomas Paine, who lived in Pennsylvania in America, and John Locke, who was a British thinker. But think about what they represented. They talked about local representation and individual rights. So during the Revolution, that was the idea. Post-Revolution, okay, the king is now removed, and now we've moved towards this idea of individual rights. Well, how are you going to establish a government based on individual rights? Well, what they came down to was during the Revolution, it's about individual rights. During the post-revolutionary phase, it's going to be about states' rights. That's the best way to provide for local power. So this is the combination of Thomas Paine and John Locke. And they passed the Articles of Confederation, which puts most power at the state level, the very weak central government. The idea, again, being that states are going to run things best. This will protect individual rights. So the federal government was a unicameral house, meaning one house. They would wage war, make treaties, and borrow money. There were some downsides to this. In order to get anything passed, you had to have 9 of 13 states vote in favor. It's very difficult to have that happen. Taxation was voluntary, which you can imagine is going to be difficult to collect taxes to pay off the debt. And any amendments to the Articles of Confederation had to have a unanimous vote across all the states. That's almost impossible to get. So because of that, we start to see some problems arising. And one of the big problems that kind of leads us into the Constitutional Convention is Shays' Rebellion. Daniel Shays, who lived up in Massachusetts, receives some notes from the local government after the Revolution that farmers would have to pay back all their mortgages, and if they could not do that, they would basically lose their farms. So he gets so upset, he leads a rebellion of over 300 people in Boston. They go down to the central place in Boston. They bring their cannons from the American Revolution and their guns, and they walk right into the courthouse and demand that the court drop this defaulting on people's mortgages. Well, the Founding Fathers at that time period got freaked out by Shays' Rebellion. By the way, his was not the only rebellion. There were actually numerous rebellions that took place throughout the colonies. And the Founding Fathers feared this could lead to a downfall if there was not some more centralized system. So in Philadelphia, 55 delegates meet together, claiming they're just going to revise the Articles. As soon as they get there, they board up all the windows, close the doors, and they go behind closed doors and say, we're actually going to create a whole new system. Now, all these guys came from the aristocracy of America, the landowning, banking, merchant, lawyer, upper class. They ended up developing a federalist system. What do I mean by that? There was going to be multiple layers of government. There would be a central government, states government. We've ended up having local governments as well. The key issues they had to deal with was representation, how to deal with the slave trade, and then how to deal with centralized power versus state power. So here's what they came up with. They came up with a series of compromises. Probably the most important is the Great Compromise, in which they said, look, we're going to have a Congress that's going to be bicameral, meaning 2 houses, with one house determined by the population, the other determined by 2 representatives per state. That way it's equal. The 2 will balance each other off. Now, one thing that's a little bit different from our time period, we tend to think of the Congress as 2 equal houses. It's not the way they thought of it back then. The Senate, which we're very familiar with today, was called the upper house. And they were determined by state legislatures, not by the common vote. We end up voting for people in the Senate by the common vote in the Progressive Age, in the early 1900s. So why did they do it this way? Well, the fear was that the House of Representatives, which is determined by the population, could become like a mob or a mobocracy, and there needed somebody to check them back. The Senate was viewed as a way to do that because if the state legislatures are voting for people to be in the upper house, the people who are in the state legislatures tend to be people of property. They will then vote for people of property to be in the Senate. In other words, the Senate is kind of the rich man's house of the Constitution. And the belief was the Senate will check back the possibility of people in the House coming up with things that were like a mob that would remove property rights from the few people in society who own most property. So the next thing was the Electoral College. The Electoral College votes for the executive or the president. But the Electoral College is based upon the states, not the people. So how does that work? Well, in this kind of an idea, people within a state vote for the president. Whoever gets the majority gets all of the electoral representatives in that state. So like in California today, we have about 55 people who are electors. Whoever wins our state, the majority, gets all of those 55 electors. So even if we have a close election, and let's say it's a 55 45 kind of an election. In the end, whoever got that 55% of the vote, they win all of the Electoral College representatives. The next big compromise was the slave trade. The slave trade was said that it would end by 1808. And in return for that, the North was going to end up getting a Fugitive Slave Act, meaning that if somebody escaped from slavery, the South, the South would get a Fugitive Slave Act, the idea being that if somebody escaped from slavery, they would have to return the slaves back. So that was the idea of the compromise. Slave trade would be ended, but at the same time, slaves would be returned back to their owners. The big one that's controversial is slaves counted as population by 3/5. Now, a lot of people misinterpret that and mean that every individual slave is counted as 3/5 of a person. That was not the idea. The idea was to take all slaves together in a state, count them up, and then divide them by 3/5. Why did they do this? Well, the North, so this is kind of ironic. The South wanted to count slaves as humans, which is strange because the South believes slaves were property. The North wanted to count slaves as property, which is strange because Northerners tended to be against the institution of slavery. So what are they really trying to do here? Well, if the South could count slaves as humans, then they could get full representation off of them. They weren't trying to get rid of slavery. They wanted to get more representatives in the House. The North wanted to count slaves as property so that they could lower the amount of representation in the South and eventually one day get rid of the institution of slavery. That was the purpose behind this. They compromised in the end and said 3/5 as a way to kind of merge the two together. Now, one thing I do want to be careful off of this, there tends to be a tendency, I think, to think of this as, oh, this is such a positive thing, right? At least in the Northern case, because at least the North is trying to push for slaves being counted as people. And in the end, at least they get a little bit of an acknowledgement that slaves really are people. But I think that misses something that's really important for this time period. Most Northerners were against the institution of slavery. They were not for racial equality. That was very different from them. That's going to be important in the future as we talk about racial politics. It's one thing to be against the slave institution and see it as like an immoral kind of system. It's another thing to eventually start to accept African Americans as being equal people. And that's going to be something that African Americans have to fight for much more in the long term. So last off, the Constitutional Convention had 3 branches of the government to separate out the powers. So Congress makes laws, the executive enforces laws, and the judicial, that one's a little more interesting. The judicial actually was not founded in order to determine if laws were constitutional. It was founded in order to deal with problems between states or problems between a country and the United States. It was really meant to be more of a referee. Over time, it gains the power to determine if laws are constitutional. So in the end, a constitution has to be ratified, and this is where we get these two groups that most people tend to think are like long-term factions, and they aren't. The Anti-Federalists versus the Federalists. So the Anti-Federalists argued that the federal system would create a centralized monarchy over time. That's why they're against that notion. Patrick Henry is a really good example. The Federalists argued a national system would protect minorities, and they argue for that in the Federalist Papers. So this is Alexander Hamilton's argument. Human societies are ruled by factions, groups of people with common interests. The solution to dealing with that problem is to create a central place, a federal government, where they can compete amongst each other. And therefore, no one faction wins. In order to compete, you really have to end up compromising between all of these factions. That comes out of Federalist Paper number 10. And the argument there is minorities and individuals are best protected in a national system, not a local system. So how does this affect us once all of this is done? Well, we end up with 2 factions in the country when we're done. The Federalists continue, and they argue for tilting power towards a centralized nation state. For example, Alexander Hamilton, who is loyal to a national government, wants to create a nation system with a market-based system, pay off the national debt, and create a national bank to attract investors. On the opposite side, we have Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson. He fears centralizing too much power in the government and a national bank, that we can become like an English model, moving towards a king. He also fears that this kind of a system, even more importantly, causes farmers to lose their independence due to gold slavery to the national bank and to foreign investors. So he fights for and wins a Bill of Rights, which becomes a way to compromise by keeping individual and state rights protected against the federal system. And that's the way you should always see the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights in many ways is really meant to be a document to protect against federal intrusion. And for Thomas Jefferson, he believes if he can get that and then expand westward into the Louisiana Territory, eventually they can create a farming republic. So what are the takeaways then from everything we've been talking about? I think first off, we had to start off with the colonial period. Please remember, the colonial period is where we get this precedent of a strong belief in local control. That comes out of the House of Burgesses, the assemblies, the religious assemblies, the Great Awakening. During the Revolutionary period, there was an establishment of a real political aversion to aristocracy and the deference to higher classes. Once we get into the Articles of Confederation, though, the aristocracy in America does become the leadership. The common people are fighting against that regularly, and whether it's common farmers, eventually African Americans, Native Americans, women, and other groups. They attempt to form the Articles of Confederation to provide local control, but that was viewed at the time as a failure. So they end up with the Constitution. And the Constitution is this constant balance between central government, states governments. Okay? So I think from there on out, we always have to take a look at this federalist system and ask, is it doing what it's supposed to be doing? Meaning, is it balancing out the need for local control, but also for the protection of a lot of minorities and individuals? Thanks a lot. See you guys in class.